Now, the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund will later today be hosting a webinar which seeks to unpack the gaps within the Children's Amendment Bill. Entitled The Children's Amendment Bill, Age and Consent, Important Gaps Remain Unaddressed. The multi-stakeholder dialogue with experts in children's rights and child law follows submissions made by the fund last year to Parliament on gaps in the Children's Amendment Bill. So for more information, we are joined by the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund CEO, Kone Gugushe. Kone, great to have you on the programme. Welcome.
Thank you, Leanne, and good morning.
So I think the best place to start is to actually talk about the shortfalls that have been identified within the Children's Amendment Bill that you've identified. Let's go through those.
Thank you, Leanne. So the Children's Amendment Bill is a very important document that seeks to augment the Children's Act. And the Children's Act is really a document that is in place to legislate protections that are necessary for children, given a number of aspects. And some of the things that we raised in our comments on the Children's Amendment Bill actually relate to the fact that there are some areas that remain unaddressed, that still remain in the Children's Act, that have not been considered and changed with the amendment of this bill. And particularly, we raised the issue of age and consent, where we feel that there certainly needs to be some kind of harmonization with regards to the age of consent for various matters that relate to children. And a case in point that we raise is the practices, traditional practices, for example, where we make an example of virginity testing and circumcision, as well as medical consent. These are matters that we think are very important for us to really talk about as a society and see how do we implement the legislation in a manner that really protects the children and entrenches their rights.
Mm. And it really is such an issue because there are so many. I mean, you've just named a few. I mean, just a quick look and seeing what some of them are. It's also access to alcohol. I mean, this is something that is also right up there. Perhaps you want to talk to us about some of the engagements that you've actually had with children on these issues and what their thoughts are and, you know, what their needs are.
Yes, so one of the key pillars of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund is to promote child participation, because we believe that the voices of children should certainly be heard and children should be allowed to engage on matters that affect them, and we should be informed by the voices of children in terms of how we respond to the things that affect them. And so we hold various activities that engage children. In September, we held a specific hearing with children on the Children's Amendment Bill, where we were asking children about their views on some of these matters. And we also have a program that is called the Nelson Mandela Children's Parliament. And this is a program that we undertake with various other partners. And through this program, in 2019, there was a children's manifesto that was put together, again, raising the voices of children with regards to some of these matters. And what we hear are that children are certainly not experiencing the protections that are entrenched in the legislation. The implementation of some of the matters where consent is required from children, they're finding that it is difficult for them to exercise their consent and choice in the manner that is envisaged. And therefore, that's why we are questioning whether these practices, some of them should even be allowed with children under a particular age.
Mm. I want to just get a bit more clarity as well, and perhaps examples on the issues relating to consent and children. Where do the complexities lie? Let's go through that.
So the complexities lie in the sense of, I think there are certain areas where you do need to provide the empowerment for children to be able to make their own choices. And you need to protect them where they can certainly agree to undertake certain things or disagree. In some areas, we know that, with South Africa being challenged with the many social ills that we have, some children don't even have parents nor guardians that are able to exercise some of these choices for them. So For example, we see this in the area of medical consent, where it's a very controversial matter. For example, in the past few weeks, we have heard reports relating to child pregnancy for children under the age of 10. And this certainly, a child under the age of 10 cannot consent to sex. And yet we find that you've got children that are either abused or forced into sexual relations, and they find themselves pregnant. And in some cases, these children may not have appropriate guardians to guide them through certain things. And so when they need to go and seek treatment, where they need to go and access contraceptives, condoms, and things like that, you need to empower children in a manner that will still, allow them to exercise their own choices. But we think that, there has to be a balance that is struck where the capacity of children to make certain decisions at certain ages is not developed enough. And therefore, we need an intervention and oversight and assistance of an older person, whether it is a parent, a guardian, or a caregiver, to guide this process. So there's lots of nuances, and we need to balance the rights that children have together with the responsibility and burden that is placed upon them.
I mean, I do know that one of the issues that came up, particularly with regard to the COVID vaccine, was also the right of children to medical care without their parents' consent. I think it's over a certain age. I think it was over 12.
And as you can imagine, this would really certainly result in certain conflicts within a family, where if the voices of the child together with the parent are in conflict with one another, how do you protect the child such that their rights are entrenched and their rights are not trampled upon because of the views of their parents? And with COVID, we know that there's certainly information overload as well as misinformation. So how do you enable children to really decipher and unpack what's right and what's wrong, and therefore ultimately make the right choice? So these nuances are things that must be handled very carefully, and they must be handled with a lot of dialogue and a lot of training and a lot of care.
Now, I mean, when we look as well at a school act, it's amazing when you start digging deeper into it and you start understanding the complexities around this. It's massive, and there are so many issues at play here. There's not just one issue we're talking about. There's also the issue that there's no rule that says a child after the age of 16 years old needs to be in school. And, that's another age of consent. It's up to them. It's basically the Children's Act and the Schools Act doesn't compel children over the age of 16 to be in a school. And this opens up a host of problems if that child just decides they're going to drop out with without the consent of anybody else. Is this also something that may be looked at?
Yes, absolutely. And really, this is why we feel that the harmonization of ages across the various legislations is important. And if you couple that together with the age of marriage being allowed at 16, what you will then find with practices like ukutwala, for example, is children are then they are abducted and forced into marriages. And certainly once a girl child marries with an older spouse, the chances of them remaining in school become even less. So all of these different legislations, we feel that they really need to be harmonized, and they need to be looked at together to see how do we entrench the rights of children so that children are protected adequately by all of this.
So let's talk to this webinar that you are planning and hopefully the steps that you will be taking forward. So who will be a part of it, and what are you hoping to achieve out of that, and perhaps some of the content and issues that are going to be addressed?
We've arranged a panel of speakers that is really quite broad, and really people that are invested in these issues. So we've got Ms. Karabo Oza, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Child Law at the University of Pretoria. We've got Mr. Edward Mafadza, who is the CEO of the Commission for the Protection of Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Rights, which is otherwise known as the CRL. And we've got Ms. Joan van Niekerk, who is a child rights activist and formerly a director of Childline, and really now is consulting in this child protection space. And then we also have Mr. Majola, who is from the Kula Development Project, which is one of our implementing partners in the Eastern Cape, to just give us perspectives on how are people experiencing some of these things on the ground? What are the lessons that they are learning? What are the vulnerabilities that they are identifying from the ground? And then the voices of children is always important to us. So we've got one of our Nelson Mandela Children's Parliament ambassadors who will also be giving us a perspective from a young person.
Well, we hope that this is going to be a really, really successful one, because there is a lot. It's an open field and one that certainly needs to be discussed quite intensely. So thank you. Thanks for outlining this for us and obviously giving us the opportunity to think more about where we need that legislation and where it needs to be tightened. So thanks again. That's the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund CEO, Kone Gugushe, talking to us. And that webinar and the findings will be released and hopefully presented before Parliament soon. All right, let's get into some of your tweets.